Hello, I'm Suzanne James for Green Left. Thank you for joining us. While Australia continues to grapple with the housing crisis, debate continues to rage about the best way forward. Few demographics have copped it worse in the neck over the housing crisis than the aged and those suffering from a disability, often one and the same. Today we'll be speaking to Abigail Boyd, Greens member in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. She's been a fearless campaigner for the disabled for many years, and her Building Better Homes campaign has been trying since 2022 to get the New South Wales State Government to introduce accessibility standards for all new builds, which have been introduced in every state except for Western Australia. To talk some more about that, and Abigail joins us now from Sydney. Abigail Boyd, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Now, just to give listeners an idea of how many people are impacted by this, Australian Bureau of Statistics says 5.5 million Australians, which is 21.4%, have a disability. 15% of people under 65 have a disability, and 52.3% of people 65 and over suffer from a disability. Now, in August, your Building Better Homes campaign held a rally on the front steps of Parliament House, protesting against the repeated refusal of the New South Wales Government to bring in the 2022 National Construction Code's livable housing silver standard for minimum housing accessibility requirements for all new builds. Could you please explain to us where that original construction standard and code came from, and what are its key minimum accessibility requirements for new constructions?
So a few years ago, the disability and building ministers from around Australia came together and debated whether or not to implement or to include in the National Construction Code a reference to certain sort of levels of accessibility for buildings. The Greens were really pushing for a gold minimum standard, but silver is better than nothing. Now, what these, I'll come to what that actually means, but what these National Construction Code is a sort of a framework that then states and territories are supposed to sort of adopt into their national law. So we have things like environmental standards in there, a whole bunch of other things. Now, the National Construction Code works with the building industry and developers as well. And the idea is that if you have this nationally consistent framework, then it's easier for these builders and others to know what they're doing and to get materials in the most cost-effective way. So that's kind of the basic framework. When it comes to minimum accessibility, the silver standard is actually really simple. It is requiring that there be at least one level access to the home, that you have at least one toilet on the ground floor, that your the corridors and hallways are a certain width to allow a wheelchair, and also for your bathrooms to have reinforced walls that you could put railings on if you wanted to in the future. So these are like the bare minimum to allow a house to be accessible for people with mobility needs.
Now, both Labor and the LNP have consistently voted against these standards, which not only will affect disabled people, but also a aged population, which the ABS also says has increased by 17% on the last census. Now, property data I've seen suggests that the average property developer operates on a minimum 20% margin. The introduction of these standards in other states roughly equates to a 1% increase in overall construction costs. Are those figures accurate according to the cost-benefit analysis you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we know is that it's relatively cheap to add these features onto a new build. But if you wanted to move into a place and have to retrofit it, it's really expensive. So although this sort of less than 1% is the amount that we have looked at and has been modelled by others, and we've sort of taken that information and we agree with it. It seems to be consistent with what we're seeing with the implementation in other states and territories. Some in the building and construction industry, and certainly the government, like to say that it's a lot more than that, and that it would put some cost on developers in New South Wales if they were to adopt the minimum accessibility standards that apparently is too much for them to bear. Now, successive governments talk a lot about housing affordability, and they talk about how important it is for houses to be affordable, and that they don't want to push up the prices by unnecessarily adding in these sorts of minimum standards. And I find it extraordinary that they think that people with disability don't also need affordable homes. So if you're excluding all of the people with disability in the state, as well as anybody who wants to age in place and anyone else with mobility needs, or even who has a friend who wants to come and visit them with mobility needs, it's just extraordinary to think that those people are not considered when it comes to thinking about what affordable housing means. It absolutely has to be accessible, but the government won't do it.
Now, I'm old enough to remember, I've been hearing since 1988, Year of the Disabled, that the government was going to make everything accessible and inclusive. And while some inroads have been made, and certainly a lot more government buildings are accessible now than what they used to be, albeit patchy, it's definitely not the same in the private sector or the rental sector. So apart from cost, what other justifications are you hearing as to why New South Wales won't introduce these basic standards? I mean, they're not a big ask, are they?
They're just not a big ask. They're the bare minimum that you could possibly do. So the government just keeps saying that it's all a bit too hard, and also this constant issue about cost. I recently, got I asked the housing minister so she was putting forward a piece of legislation that would have asked for some basic information from community housing providers so that she could work out exactly how much social housing stock there was in New South Wales. I put up an amendment that would require her to actually work out how much of that stock was accessible as well. And the response I got was that that was too hard to do, apparently. To which I responded with, what's hard? Finding a house to live in when you're a person with mobility needs. But this is what we're dealing with here. It's this stubbornness from a government that I don't know why it is that they care so little about providing accessible housing, but there seems to be a real I don't know if it's a block in their thinking, but they just refuse outright to do anything that could upset developers in New South Wales.
Do you feel in your day-to-day working in Parliament House, and I know a lot of different people work there across a number of roles and different parties and parliamentary staff and whatnot, do you get the impression generally that there's a general understanding of just how much of a difference even the most basic of inaccessibility can make to a disabled person?
I think time and again, we see ministers in every portfolio area putting people with disability at the bottom of the pile when it comes to what they're looking at and what they prioritise. And, in the recent budget, there was a total of, I think we got it down to about $8 million in apparently new spending for initiatives to improve accessibility and inclusion in New South Wales, which is an incredibly small amount. And when we delved into it, it turned out that a lot of that wasn't anything very exciting and was simple things like, putting the government's own buildings up to scratch to make them accessible. So there, I've called it ableism, and I think it is quite an ableist attitude to be so dismissive of, which is almost 1.5 million people in New South Wales who are living with disability. I'm also very concerned that there is now this push to wind back even further the advances that have been made in other states and territories when it comes to the National Construction Code, because we have, as part of the productivity talks or productivity roundtable that's happening at the moment, there's a push by builders and developers to cut the so-called red tape and stop community and others being able to comment on where development is and what that development should look like. I think what we will see, far from New South Wales actually embracing finally national construction minimum accessibility standards, is actually winding it even further back. Being convinced by the big developers and the housing corps that somehow anything that results in quality accessible housing is somehow going to set back housing supply, which I don't think the evidence is there for. So long answer to your question. The short answer really is just, I think unfortunately the New South Wales government does not prioritise people with disability. I think there is an ableism and a lack of inclusion that permeates through Parliament and its ministers in particular. And yeah, I really worry that they much rather pay attention to the big developers than they do to individuals.
Which leads me to my next question, which was about the current push by the developer lobby and also by other interest groups to decrease council oversights in relation to new developments and increase height requirements and things like that. That's being pushed by outfits like Sydney YIMBY, the Yes in My Backyard movement. Certainly the developers aren't going to stand in the way of that mentality. So in response to questions from me about disability accessibility standards that you've been trying to introduce, Abigail, NIMBY Sydney replied with this, and I quote, "We do not have a position on the proposed changes, but are strongly supportive of stricter enforcement of existing standards," unquote. Standards which, as you point out, don't actually include any sort of disability accessibility. So high density may address some of the housing shortage, notwithstanding the various tax reforms and things that need to go with it. But that's all right for the able-bodied and fully employed in the inner city when they have high density housing and it's close to transport and whatnot. But where does that leave the disabled and elderly who are already being evicted in numbers from their secure inner city public housing so it can be sold off to private developers who put up towers that may or may not be accessible and may or may not have a affordable housing component?
I think there's two aspects to that question. I think the first is around who we allow to build houses. And I think that there has been this debate, the so-called NIMBY versus YIMBY debate, which focuses on it. I think it falsely equates any objection to a particular housing development as being a NIMBY approach. It's really important that when we build houses, we're building the right houses. And that means that leaving housing supply up to the big developers rather than building public housing ourselves can result in buildings of a lower quality and buildings that are really not fit for purpose and certainly not genuinely affordable. So I think there's that issue that we should absolutely be focusing on building more public housing and on ensuring genuinely affordable housing as part of any mix of new supply coming in from developers. But this idea that we then, sort of cut or reduce the amount of red tape, I think needs to be carefully looked at as well. One of the issues around implementing the minimum accessibility standards has been around the sort of class of property that you're looking at. And some people have said we can't introduce this because if you've got, say, a single-story house built on top of a hill, that's obviously going to have more challenges to it than if you've got a 10-story inner city apartment. Now, I would argue that again, that's a bit of a false argument. I think that we are smart enough to provide exceptions where it's necessary, but also we could, at the very, very least, be saying that those high story, like those multi-story new developments that are being built by developers, at least they should comply with the minimum accessibility standards. It's much easier to provide lifts in those sorts of properties, for example, and to build them from the beginning with broader, with wider corridors and everything else, than it is necessarily for that, the sort of residential house build. So I think if we're on the verge of creating and producing a whole lot more property out there, and it is of that, I think they call it class 2 property, then we should be ensuring that all of them are built with accessibility in mind, and mandating the National Construction Code minimum accessibility standards, at least for those. So I'm not sure I've answered your question. I've kind of hopped around, but I think there's a couple of things in there.
The other thing that concerns me is, let's say in an ideal world, a developer does the right thing and actually builds a tower which is made up of very basic accessibility standards included in all units, plus they agree to 30% housing, which is quote unquote affordable, or community housing, which by the way still isn't public housing. That's a whole other issue.
Mm.
What about the street accessibility? Because so many times I've seen things that are buildings and facilities and hospitals even that are allegedly disabled accessible, but you get out of the car in the car park and you can't get up the gutter, or the lift's blocked, or there's goods lifts out of commission and there's no alternative, or there's some reason why anybody with mobility issues might not be able to use it. Is there any street accessibility built into the standards you speak of?
Um, I don't think so. I would have to go and check. I don't believe so. But I think you've touched on another sort of massive issue. We get this a lot when it comes to transport. And so the huge number of stations across New South Wales, of train stations and other forms of public transport, are not accessible. We were supposed to get all of these modes of public transport accessible under a 2002 agreement. It was supposed to happen by 2024 at the latest, I think, for all forms of transport. None of the states and territories met that deadline. And what you find is that even where you do have an accessible train station, say, it might only be accessible on one side of the platform. So you can only go one way. And if you want to come back, you have to hop off at a different one. Often we have accessible toilets that when you actually come to use them, they, have cleaning products stored in them, or they happen to be out of order. And then, the connections between, you might have technically an accessible bus, and you might have technically an accessible station, but the walkway between the two is not accessible. So there's so much work to do to make it so that you can actually have true accessibility for all of these things, whether it's housing or transport or anything else. But we have just no willingness from government to do the things that they promise that they will do. And again, we're looking at, anywhere up to 20% of the population. It is extraordinary that the governments of the day don't seem to want to address those issues. But it's really, really important. And when it comes to, pathways, we've been looking at, for example, making sure that you have accessibility for new EV chargers in the inner west on the streets level. Like, those sorts of things are not finding their way into the average decision makers planning, and that needs to change. They need to start applying that disability lens to every decision that government makes.
I'd just like to finish, second last question, is in relation to the convoluted patchwork that is now the home modification programs. There's a number of fingers in that pie now with NDIS and aged care packages, and also there's a split between public and private residences, private rentals, affordable accessibility, and also public and community housing, as it's now known. Now, I've worked with a lot of people in the last few years with doing various advocacy work and articles in relation to housing. And even in public housing, people are having a very difficult time getting modifications done. So even with the accessibility standards built into new builds, you're still going to have these issues, aren't you? Because none of it is ever going to be one size fits all. Because even with the same condition, the same disability, the person need can vary greatly. What's your response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I get a lot of people contacting my office with those issues. I know that my colleague, Senator Jordan Steele John, has been very good at trying to take on and advocate for some of those people. But you're right. I mean, there is, not one size doesn't fit all, which is why it's so frustrating that we can't even do the minimum. But also now with the latest changes to the NDIS, which the government keeps swearing has not resulted in people being kicked off their support. We are just hearing from people all the time, and I know that the disability peak organisations are also hearing from people who are saying that they're suddenly getting chucked off of their NDIS package and they're not being able to get the support they need, whether it's for medical treatment or for basic things like retrofitting housing and all the rest of it. So look, there's so much more that needs to be done. Um, it's it's really frustrating working in this space and not knowing, um, I guess, how to eventually shift people out of that sort of ableist thinking. But we have so much to do. And I think just getting people to understand that it's, you know, we all if if we don't have a disability ourselves, we know people who do. Any person can find themselves with a mobility need at any time. Um, this is something that should concern every single person, and I would hope that we start putting a little bit more pressure on governments collectively than we have.
Last question. I have interviewed Jordan Steele John on a number of occasions, especially about the outcomes or lack thereof from the Disability Royal Commission and also Bill Shorten's NDIS review. All of that combined with everything you've told me in my own life experience, are we barking up the right tree with the current disabled advocacy model? Because we keep getting ignored, we keep having inquiries, we keep having, senators come on TV and say we're going to make it accessible and this, that, and the other thing, but it just keeps getting worse and worse. Everything from workplace accessibility to new building standards. The government's done very little at federal level out of the Royal Commission. State government obviously couldn't care less about disability building standards, otherwise they would have done it already because it's such a small piece of the developer profit pie. What else can we do, Abigail, with the disability advocacy model? Because you just start to feel like you're only here so developers and privatised providers can gouge the NDIS package.
Yeah, I mean, my view is the NDIS has not lived up to its promise. And I think part of the problem has been the privatization of services and the outsourcing of services to this kind of market-based mechanism. But I think part of the problem we have at the moment is there's been I think when Labor got into power at a federal level, and then particularly when they got into power at New South Wales level, I think there was a feeling of hope that things would change, and that from a very basic social justice perspective, we were going to end up with a focus on people with disability and finally sort of correcting the wrongs of the past. I think that hope has been replaced with a bit of despair, um, and that disappointment that the Labor government hasn't done what we thought they might do. So I think we now need to turn that despair into hope. I think that this is a fundamental, when it comes to, the fundamental human rights of people with disability, I think it is a core social justice issue. And I think we need to build alliances across the union movement, across all sort of different sort of, groups within social justice movement and make it a much higher priority for all of us going forward. So it's hard not to despair, but I do think that we kind of went from the hope to the despair, and after despair comes action. So this is the moment that we have to make our voices loud. and come together across different movements to really build a coalition of support for finally getting some justice for people with disability.
And your support and advocacy has certainly never wavered, and I hope you know how much the disability community appreciates it.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for your continued interest.
Thank you, Abigail, very much for your time today. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
That was Abigail Boyd, New South Wales Greens MP, talking about the New South Wales State Government and their cohorts of the LNP refusing to introduce basic accessibility standards for the disabled for all new builds. I'm Suzanne James for Green Left. Thank you for joining us.